So today I want to talk about tithing and the latter rain and how they're connected together. And while we might not see a connection there, there is a connection there, and that is through Malachi 3:10. Now, most people take this verse and take it and believe that it's speaking about a prosperity gospel. But this verse is not whatsoever talking about this. The only way it is actually talking about this is through the law, that we need to keep all God's commandments and his statutes, and then God can bless us. And the tithe is one of them. So if you don't tithe, you can't actually have that. So that is how it can be connected to the prosperity of Israel. But if we think about it, we can look at the history of many, many people in the Bible, and they did not have this temporal prosperity or this wealth that everybody thinks is tied to this. Think about Jesus. He had no place to lay his head. Look at the disciples and where they were and how they followed him, and after the cross, what they did. All the different people that were persecuted through all the years, all the people during the Reformation. We can go to the Israelites as they're traveling through the wilderness and as they were in Egypt and all these different places. Now, yes, there might have been periods where they were not tithing at that time, say if they were in Egypt. I don't know what actually happened there. But tithing is part of the latter rain, and we're going to see that. But in order to first see that, we need to first see what tithe actually is. Now, let me just read the verse from Malachi 3:10. We'll get it into context, and then we'll talk about what exactly is tithe. So Malachi 3:10, it says, "Bring ye all the tithes into the storehouse, that there may be meat in mine house. And prove me now herewith, saith the Lord of hosts, if I will not open you the windows of heaven, and pour you out a blessing, that there shall not be room enough to receive it." So this verse has many figurative things in it. And one of the first things we need to understand is, what is a storehouse? What is a storehouse that God says, bring ye all the tithes into? Well, we find this in Numbers 18, verse 26. And while this doesn't say storehouse, this tells us what actually is a storehouse. It says, "Thus speak unto the Levites, and say unto them, When ye take of the children of Israel the tithes which I have given you from them for your inheritance, then ye shall offer up a heave offering of it for the Lord, even a tenth part of the tithe." So here we see that the tithe went directly to the Levites. The Levites were the people that officiated in the temple, the people that upkept the temple. It was the singers, the people that played musical instruments, and all these different things. I imagine their worship services were something else back in their day, where you had, like however many, 20, 30,000 people, like playing instruments and singing in the wilderness as they're traveling through the wilderness. These were professional. Well, they became professional singers and music players and things like that. And I'm just assuming like it'd be like that. It would just be something else to hear. It would have been amazing. And I don't think we can fathom what that time actually would have been like, and how God's glory was, going through the earth even at that time as they traveled through the wilderness and were going from place to place. It would have been something to be seen. So we now know what the storehouse is. So what exactly is a tithe? So we can find this in Leviticus 27. "And all the tithe of the land, whether it be the seed of the land or of the fruit of the tree, it is the Lord's, it is holy unto the Lord. And if a man will at all redeem out of his tithes, he shall add thereunto a fifth part. And concerning the tithe of the herd or of the flock, or even whatsoever passeth under thy rod, a tenth shall be holy unto the Lord." So this is really interesting. It gives us a few different things. It tells us that a tithe can be the fruit of the tree, the fruit of the seed of the land, which would have been grains and different things like that. That it was also animals, and anything that really was considered food was what was to be given to them. But it said something really interesting here. It actually said that you could actually withhold your tithe for a time. You didn't have to give it all the time. It says, "If a man will redeem aught of his tithes, he shall add unto it a fifth part." So somebody might say, well, this is talking about when they came into the land of Israel, which this probably is kind of referencing. And they're coming and they're starting again. And God's like, hey, keep the tithe. I'm still going to bless you. This is in the law. You're going to keep your tithe. I'm still going to bless you. But now instead of giving me just a tenth of what you had before, we're going to add a fifth onto it. So now you're going to have to give more. So instead of being just 10%, it's now 15%. And I'm going to bless you in that. And I'm going to give you even more when you do this thing. Isn't that amazing? So some people might be like, what? He wants to take 50. God gave it to you in the beginning. The fact that you have breath and life is just a gift of God. So whatever we have, our temporal prosperity, comes from God. And remember, just look at Jesus, who had no place to lay his head, but he was the most prosperous person on earth. So if we can get stuff out of our mind, put God into our mind and what we should be doing for him and for those around us, our perceptions change and we don't think about all the stuff that we have or want, or yeah, it's mostly want. How many people need? What do we need? The Bible tells us we need food and clothing. So here we see that food, that the tithe is talking about food. But what about the clothing for all these Levites? Because the Levites just did work for God. They might have had some side businesses that they tried to make a little bit of money on. I don't know how that worked. But essentially, their whole life was dedicated to doing things for God. So through the tithe, they had food. So now let's go to a verse that would show where the clothing actually came from. In Deuteronomy 14:22 to 25, it says, Thou shalt truly tithe all the increase of thy seed that the field bringeth forth year by year, and thou shalt eat before the Lord thy God in the place which he shall choose to place his name there, and the tithe of thy corn and of thy wine and of thine oil, and the firstlings of thine herds and of thy flocks, that thou mayest learn to fear the Lord thy God always. And if the way be too long for thee, so that thou art not able to carry it, or if the place be too far from thee, which the Lord thy God shall choose to set his name there, when the Lord God hath blessed thee, then thou shalt turn it into money, and bind up the money in thine hand, and thou shalt go unto the place which the Lord thy God shall choose. So here we see that the people that lived too far away from the people that were their ministers, they were supposed to turn it into money, and then they could bring it to them then or send it to them or however they needed to do it or wanted to do it. Now, technically, every year the males were commanded 3 times a year to go to Jerusalem for the feast. So that time they could have given their money and their tithes and stuff like that. But there was Levites that were in other towns too. They weren't just always in Jerusalem. Um, so the people that lived in the country, or they're too far away, or they're traveling on long journeys or something like that, and they came back, they could still bring their tithe. Now, a lot of people might think that they needed to bring their tithe uh, all the time, every year. As soon as when something happened, then they brought their tithe. And essentially, that's what they did for the most part. But there is also an exception to this. And the reason for it might have been that when they came into the promised land, they were to start their own homesteads. Essentially, they're all homesteading. And the first year they probably didn't have much increase. The second year might have still not been as great, and then the third year, they could have brought their tithe. It didn't actually have to be brought every year. So for a lot of people today that are struggling and saying, oh, I'm looking at what's going on, what's being taught in the churches and stuff like that, and they don't feel comfortable giving a tithe, there's actually a little bit of leeway here. In Deuteronomy 14:27 it says, And the Levite that is within thy gates, thou shalt not forsake him, for he hath no part nor inheritance with thee. And at the end of 3 years thou shalt bring forth all the tithe of the increase of the same year, and thou shalt lay it up within thy gates. And the Levite, because he hath no part nor inheritance with thee, and the stranger and the fatherless and the widow, which are within thine gates, shall come and eat and be satisfied, and the Lord thy God may bless thee of all the work of thine hand which thou doest. So here we see in this verse that there was this 3 year kind of grace period where they didn't have to tithe year by year. Now, a lot of that might have to turn into money because there's some things that don't keep. They're going to bring fresh vegetables. Either they'd have to dry them. They obviously didn't do any canning back then. So they'd have to dry everything. So you just had dried food and fresh food. That's pretty much all you had. Or you could turn it into money. So that might have been something that they did. And the amazing part about it is it says that when you do this, it goes to the Levites that they may bless a stranger and you and everyone else. Well, how did it bless them? Well, obviously, if you go to a Levite's house, they're going to feed you, do whatever. So it can be literally done like that, but also that they taught you. They broke the bread of life and they shared that with people so that way the stranger could be blessed and the fatherless and the widow and everyone like that. While there's a physical blessing attained for those that came to the Levites, there was also a spiritual blessing. So we're going to go back to the verse in Malachi 3:10, and I'll just say it again, and we're going to get the context of this. Now that we know that a tithe is either the food that you have or the money that you give. So God always says that you'll always have food and you'll always have raiment. Never says anything about a home, right? So the Israelites going through the wilderness didn't really have a home. So God always promises those things. So for the Levites, their food and their raiment was provided for, whether it was food literally given to them or whether it was given to them in money, and then they could provide for themselves raiment. And this did not have to be given continually. It could also be given in the third year, and that was the year of the tithe. Okay, now let me read this verse again, and we're going to start picking apart a little bit of Malachi 3:10. Bring ye all the tithes into the storehouse, so the storehouse is the Levites, that there may be meat in mine house, right? So it's not talking, so it's going to be food in his house, but it's also talking spiritually, right? It's talking about that there might be spiritual food in mine house. And then it says, and prove me now herewith, saith the Lord of hosts, if I will not open you the windows of heaven. Okay, windows of heaven. There aren't windows in heaven. There are windows in heaven, but there aren't really anything that we can see. So we know that this verse is figurative. So this is why I brought to you some figurative meaning of the verse before. The storehouse, figurative meaning, Levites, right? Meat was food, but it's also speaking about spiritual food. So now it's talking about opening up the windows of heaven. And then it says, and pour you out a blessing that there be not room enough to receive it. So God's going to open windows in heaven, something's going to pour out that there's not going to be room enough for us to receive it. Well, what could that be? Well, let's just look up first, what are windows of heaven? And we can first find the first example in Genesis 7:11. It says, in the 600th year of Noah's life, in the second month of the 17th day of the month, the same day were all the fountains of the great deep broken up, and the windows of heaven were opened. All right, so that's really interesting. So we know that the windows of heaven was up in the sky. Now, the ground before was watered by a mist that watered the whole earth. There wasn't clouds in the sky, so no water ever fell from heaven until this time. So now we're going to go to Genesis 8:2 to actually see what's actually falling out of these windows. In Genesis 8:2 it says, the fountains also of the deep and the windows of heaven were stopped, and the rain from heaven was restrained. So here we see that the windows of heaven were opened and rain fell down. Now let's look for a second witness for this. We find this in Joel 2:23, which says, the fountains also of the deep and the windows of heaven were stopped, and the rain from heaven was restrained. So we see that there was rain up in heaven. It didn't run out. It didn't run out whatsoever. There's tons and tons of water and rain above us, right? This is what it's teaching. And it was restrained. It didn't end. So remember that. It did not end. It wasn't like everything was given at that time. And the reason why I'm saying this is because we find in Deuteronomy 32, verse 2, something really interesting. It says, my doctrine shall drop as the rain, my speech shall distill as the dew, as the small rain upon the tender herb, and as the showers upon the grass. Whoa, isn't that fascinating? So the Bible says that rain is doctrine, and it was restrained. So in Moses' time, God restrained doctrine, right? We're seeing this as being prophetic in Joel. We see it being literal in Genesis. All these different things speaking to us about doctrine falling on us. So now we're looking at it and we're seeing, hey, let there be tithe, or, bring ye the tithe into the storehouse, that there might be doctrine in mine house. For all the people that aren't tithing in them anymore, and they're like, we're not being fed, and all these different things are happening, part of it is probably because a lot of people aren't tithing. Now, we also have to remember that where there's prosperity, there's also corruption. But God works on a world, God works never thinking about the evil, always thinking about the good, but making exceptions for the evil that he knows is going to come in. So God knew that Israel was going to be corrupt. God knows everything. He knew that, but he still wanted the tithe to go into his house. because from his house, they're still going to give doctrine. Why did God restrain the doctrine? Why did he stop the doctrine? Well, there is actually a reason for it, because there's a former rain and the latter rain. So we look at Noah's time and we can see that that was the former rain. We look at the disciples' time and we still know that that was a former rain. But we know that the latter rain, as the disciples will tell us, will be poured out at the end of time. So we have Noah, we have the disciples, and we see that they're getting showers, and this was the former rain. Now there's a verse in Joel 2:23 that says, "Be glad then, ye children of Zion, and rejoice in the Lord your God, for he hath given you the former rain moderately, and he will cause to come down for you the rain, the former rain and the latter rain in the first month." Now that's interesting that both of them come in the same month and that it is the first month of the year. I can't say I know for sure exactly why that is, but I'm going to speculate. Everything revolves around Jesus. It's about the cross. And then the first month represented Jesus' death on the cross. We have the Passover, which is typifying that event. But we also have tabernacles, which also typifies that event. Both of them are connected to that event. Both of them are saying the same thing and different things at the same time and giving different information. But from the time that Jesus died on the cross, we see that there is a harvest from that time. And the harvest ends at tabernacles. So these are showing that there's a period of time where I'm just going to say that the doctrine or the reign has been clarified, because we had the Old Testament and it was a lot of figures and types. And in the New Testament, the disciples break down a lot of these figures and types and then teach a lot about it. So you had the former rain, the beginning rain, the early rain starting with the disciples, and we have the end coming at our time, which is representing tabernacles. And that will be the last harvest there is. Now, like I said, I'm speculating about this, but it makes sense in context when Jesus said this. In John 4:35, "Say not ye that there are 4 months, and then cometh the harvest. Behold, I say unto you, lift up your eyes and look on the fields, for they are white already to harvest." So here we see that everything that revolved around that Passover in the first month, and that was a transition from winter to summer. There were only two seasons in the Bible, and that was just winter and summer. So let's think back to our type in Genesis when the rain had stopped. So when the Bible says that the waters were restrained from up above, that means that it wasn't everything. They didn't have it all. It was restrained. They had the former rain, but the latter rain comes at the end, and it's what finishes off the harvest at the end of time. And this is still doctrine. There's a Bible verse in Matthew 5:45 that says, "That ye may be the children of your Father which is in heaven, for he maketh the sun to rise on the evil and on the good, and sendeth rain on the just and on the unjust." Here we need to see something, that the rain comes on the just and on the unjust. So what happened in Noah's time would be more similar to what's going to happen in our time. And it was the same as what happened in the disciples' time. I guess it's the same all across the board. The rain came on the just and it changed their heart. And so Noah and his family were saved. The rain also came to all the unjust, but it did nothing for them. The latter rain was falling, or the early rain and the former rain was falling all around, on hearts all around, but it didn't help the many because it didn't change their hearts. They didn't turn to God. But for those that followed Christ, it made a change in their lives. And this is something that we need to see and know and understand, that we need to have the former rain first before the latter rain. Because if you get the latter rain, the seed hasn't germinated, or if it germinates with the latter rain, and it doesn't bring forth fruit. And if we only have the former rain, but we don't have the latter rain, we're stuck where we are. And many churches today, that's where they are, is they have some doctrine, but they never moved along. Truth is progressive. The Bible is a living word. And it's always unfolding more and more truth to everyone. It's not stopped, it's not stagnant. And here at the end of time, God's going to have a people on this earth that are going to perfectly reflect his image. And they're going to have the former rain, which we need to have as well, and we need to have the latter rain. And one is not independent of the other. The truth in the beginning is still the truth at the end. But the amazing thing about it is if you're paying all your tithes into the storehouse, right? So it's doing everything, giving all your life to God. 1/10 of your life should be dedicated to doing the work of ministry of God, of the church. That is part of your tithe too. It's not just about money, right? It's about what you do. You still need to live, you still need to work the land and do whatever you need to do to live. But God says, hey, go ye out into all the world and proclaim the gospel. And we need to do that. That's part of the former rain, which brings us to the latter rain. We still need to be doing that here at the end of time. And that brings us to an amazing part where when we think about that, it says in Malachi 3:10 that he's going to open the windows of heaven and pour ye out a blessing that you shall not have room enough to receive it, right? We need to be taking truth as it comes, and we need to be adopting it into our lives. And if we're not, then we can't get more. We can't, until we adopt that into our lives, God can't give us more, because it would be useless to us if we can't take in the rain that he gave us. He can't give us more rain because it just runs over. So it is with all the parts of the body. We have to realize that God has children in all the earth, and not everyone has all the truth all put together. Not yet. The Bible does talk about a people at the end of time that are completely united and in harmony with each other, and they will be on the same page. But God says, I'm going to pour you out all this doctrine. You're not going to have room enough to retain it. So we can't be thinking we have all the light and there's nothing more we can learn. God says, no, my family, my church on this earth is on all one body. And while this part might seem to be disconnected from this part, because here's the hand, but there's an arm and a forearm and the body and a leg and a kneecap, and all these things are in between the hand and the foot, they're still my body. The head might be one church, which I believe is the Seventh-day Adventist church, and it encompasses everyone else too. And even the head doesn't have all the doctrine. We have to realize this. They just have the message that comes at the end of time that fits all this body together. And that is the beauty of Malachi 3:10. Bring ye all the tithes into the storehouse, that there may be meat in mine house. Now the next verse says, right after that verse, and I will rebuke the devourer for your sakes, and he shall not destroy the fruits of your ground, neither shall your vine cast her fruit before the time in the field, saith the Lord of hosts. Those that accept the early and the latter rain are those fruits. God will not let them be destroyed by Satan, and the fruit will not be cast before its time. God has his finishing work to do, and he's using us to do it, and Satan cannot stop it.